Good afternoon, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Matt Ricci. I'm a postdoc at Brown's Data Science Initiative, and I'm happy to welcome you today to our current Data Wednesday lecture. We have a very nice and exciting lineup of speakers this year, including Brendan Lake and Marta Gonzalez. Will speak at later sessions, which you can read about more on the DSI website. We're today continuing interesting theme of network dynamics that we've kept throughout the semester so far. We had Steve Strogatz here a little while ago. We had Mark Timma here last week. And today we're very lucky to have with us Damon Centola, who is professor in the Annenberg School for Communication, School of Arts and Sciences, and the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania, where he is director of the Network Dynamics Group. A scholar of social networks, social epidemiology, and cultural evolution, his forthcoming book is entitled Change. Today, he will speak about how similar meaning systems emerge across diverse cultures. And would you please join me in welcoming Damon Centola?
Great. Thanks, you, Matt. Thanks. So I'm going to talk today about this work. This is forthcoming in Nature Communications, so you can sort of, get a sense of the project and then some of the directions the project's going in. I want to start today just a couple of minutes before getting into the meat of the paper and the sort of this research project by giving a little bit of background on sort of the big research context for this, both methodologically and also theoretically, because there's a lot of machinery that sits behind research like this. And I think for a seminar like this with people from different departments, a lot of whom are thinking about different methods, I think this kind of orientation is hopefully helpful and productive. So to start, I just want to talk a little bit about the method of internet experiments and the way that I approach it and the reason for doing this kind of work, which is heavily theoretically motivated by my background in sociology and physics. And then in particular, I want to give some context for the study that comes from the book that's coming out, and which gives kind of a broader theoretical background for like why study these kinds of problems and how we study them. So just a kind of preparatory remark on methods really has to do with this question of, this question, if you were to see this sort of this process, which we refer to as schooling, and to try to understand that process, one approach would be to study each of these, 50,000 fish individually. And if you looked at these fish one at a time, in every possible way, psychologically, physiologically, and so forth, the question is, could you ever infer these collective behaviors that they produce as a group? And further, could you figure out what interventions would disrupt this collective behavior and what interventions would make it more coherent? And my response really is that if you want to understand a schooling process, which of course, now I'm speaking more generally about collective behavior. So a schooling process, the process of changing social norms, the process of, collective voting, the process of mobilizing Black Lives Matter, the process of collective behaviors emerging in which lots of interdependent people sort of coordinate on some surprising dynamic. You need to study these populations as units of observation, which is to say, if you want to study schooling, you have to study schools. And so studying fish individually one at a time and then trying to subsequently aggregate doesn't really explain these schooling dynamics, and certainly doesn't tell you what features of the environment are going to amplify or impede these schooling dynamics. And this is where replication becomes important because if you look at this data set and you say, wow, you've got 50,000 data points, it's a lot. I look at that group of fish and I say, well, you've got one data point. You've got a school. And if you want to understand how some intervention affects that sort of population and its behavior, then you need to replicate at the population level. And that's methodologically the approach that I take in all of our studies. So I just want to give you some background on now the theory that I use to sort of study these kinds of population dynamics. So we think about social change, and this really is what the context that comes out in the book and that frames this particular research project is based on. If you look at social change, we typically have this idea in mind of some kind of network architecture that mediates the social influence among people. And that there are some people who are highly connected, and we think of them as the sort of center of the network, and we've got notions of centrality like degree centrality, betweenness centrality, eigenvector centrality, all of which typically revolve around the idea of information flow. And so someone who's highly connected at the center of the network is someone who's highly central to the process of information flow. And then we've got people in the periphery who are in these kind of, much less connected social clusters that are sort of interconnected throughout the sort of edges of the social network. And when we think about social change processes, and I like the example of Arab Spring because we have really good data on Arab Spring, um, we think about something, emerging from someone who's highly connected, and then it spreads from that person who we might refer to as an influencer to everyone they're connected to, and then from those people to their neighbors, and from those people to their neighbors. And it generates this really intuitive dynamic of spreading from the core, or the sort of highly connected people, to the periphery. And that is really, for about a century, how we've thought about social change. We now use the term influencer. And before that, 10, 20 years ago, we used to talk about hubs and social stars. And then, of course, before that, 50 years ago, we would talk about opinion leaders. But they're all basically the same concept. Um, what we have today that's different is data that can evaluate this very compelling and intuitive theory, and in particular from Arab Spring in Egypt in 2011. And what we see is that when that revolution emerged, it didn't actually grow from the hubs. It started with some people in the periphery who coordinated with each other, and then reinforced the growth of the movement around the periphery of the networks, and actually spread in a sort of rapid fashion, growing a critical mass that ultimately took over the center of the network, and changed the entire population to sort of an activating, revolutionary population. Now, when we think about social change, what this means is that we've got two very different pictures, and this creates a fundamental empirical puzzle that then actually reveals a new theory of social change and how it works. Um, and on the left-hand side, you've got a story where, change begins at the center and radiates outward to the periphery. And on the right-hand side, you've got the data that's saying that actually change originates in the periphery and radiates inwards to the center. And so the question is, first of all, what goes wrong and how do we reconcile that? And what goes wrong here really is that we have thought for a long time, scientists, and then as a result, lay people, about change epidemiologically, which is to say, we think about spreading in terms of exposure. And this is, the basic model of simple contagion, which is that, if someone's connected to a lot of people, then, intuitively, if that person has the measles, or that person gets, the novel coronavirus, then that person's going to infect a lot of people, right? And this is what we think of as like super spreaders for diseases. And we tend to use that intuition in the social domain to think about spreading behavior change, or any kind of social change, or any kind of social norm, really. And that's the intuition of the influencer. But the problem is that the epidemiological intuition, while it works really well for diseases and also works well for thinking about information, doesn't work for complex contagions, which are basically social and behavioral changes that encounter some sort of resistance. And in that case, the social context and the kind of the peer feedback that people experience among their neighbors really alter the dynamics of spreading and of personal behavior in a way that's quite different from epidemiology. In fact, in some cases, it's the opposite. And this has given rise to a series of myths. And this is the kind of stuff that I discuss in the book. And as I said, it's kind of the background for this paper. So, the book starts out with the three myths of diffusion and talks about, virality as a very compelling concept that we use for thinking about innovations and change. That stickiness, is this notion that's actually based on the idea of certain diseases being more infectious, and it's been generalized to products and behaviors. And then, of course, the influencer, which is the highly connected social hub that's responsible for rapid propagation. These three ideas are compelling and effective in a viral context, or in a disease context, and completely misleading. Both theoretically, they've kind of led us astray in terms of the science of social change, and also, of course, in practical contexts. And then what I do in the book is flesh out what this means for understanding how networks actually operate, and sort of the way to build a contagion infrastructure, a pattern of networks among communities in a society, or organizational divisions within a company that allow for more effective change, and then what this ultimately means for tipping points, for reaching kind of critical mass dynamics that reach change. So this is the book. The book comes out on the 21st, on January 19th. And there's a website associated with this with, overall descriptions and videos. But this provides kind of a general context for the papers that then now articulate this project. So the first of these papers is this study with myself and the physicist Andrea Baron-Kelly, looking at the emergence of conventions. And then we generalize this idea to look at how, when social norms are established, tipping points can come along to sort of trigger a change in a social norm. And then all of this sort of research is then what gives rise to the current study I'm going to talk about today, which is, again, forthcoming in Nature Communications, which is this question of how do novel category systems, which I'm going to talk about meaning systems, and I'll explain that in a moment, really emerge? And this is a question that's just been untouched in the formal and theoretical literature, and because it's extremely hard to study, and I'll get into that, why methodologically this is kind of an interesting domain to try to work in, and also just really ripe for like new theoretical development. This work, this paper in particular, is a PhD dissertation from Doug Gilbo, and he just finished at Annenberg in May, and now he's an assistant professor at Berkeley. And obviously our colleague Andrea Baron-Kelly, who's a physicist, and he's an assistant professor of math at City University London. So what really motivates, in many ways, the kind of study of categories is this big issue that in order to determine the value of really anything, the value of a company, the value of a product, the value of a new idea, we need to understand what its sort of competitors are in some sort of relevant space. So the famous example from the late 90s, this was work done by Ezra, who was at Stanford and then now at MIT, was looking at the way that market analysts evaluate new companies. And basically the conclusion was, look, if a company comes out and their product doesn't fall within a recognizable category, then analysts simply cannot determine the value of the company. They need to determine sort of comparable companies in the relevant space. So now we have the category of social media. And so, lots of companies can come out and say we're social media companies. But when there was this space, and it was like Friendster kind of existed, people sort of understood, MySpace people kind of understood, and then Facebook showed up, and people were struggling to figure out what it was. And then it became this sort of, prototype, and then a lot of other companies sort of were attracted to that space as the space of social media. But a lot of other companies tried in that time to become recognizable entities and failed because no one could determine really what they were, what their market value was. Equivalently, it's the same for products, it's the same for technologies, and interestingly, also the same for art, which is to say, art is divided into these schools. And if you contribute to a school, then the quality and the status and the value of your art is determined by sort of holding it side by side with the other members of that school. But if your art doesn't really fit into any recognizable category, then it's hard to determine what the value of that art is. And so this is something that sociologists have thought about for a long time in terms of the role of categories. And it goes back to kind of a Kantian intuition about, the role of categories in kind of structuring our world, both the natural world and obviously the social world. But one question that's never interrogated, partly because it's just, inaccessible, is, well, where do these categories come from? And we can talk about, the process by which an existing set of categories might change and a new kind of category like social media may emerge, and then a bunch of stuff can be sort of bunched into that category. But the deeper question is, well, where does this whole system come from? How do we go from sort of nothing to some sort of coherent sense in which we can all kind of organize the world, and we can talk to each other, and we can point and refer to objects and all agree that these objects are of the same kind? And that sort of, big question has occupied sociologists and cognitive scientists and psychologists for, generations. The sociological answer really is social construction, which is that, it's basically just people talking to people. There's communication dynamics within social networks, and that leads to some sort of agreement about how the world is organized. And this seems to make sense when we talk about, companies and technologies and products because it's all socially constructed. The value is sort of created by people. Um, and that intuition gives us a kind of this interesting resulting hypothesis, which is that when you look at different cultures, you should expect to see radically different, systems of meaning or systems of categories emerging in different cultures because, that process of communication and sort of coordination among people is relatively arbitrary and with, different groups of people can produce pretty much anything they want. And that's the social construction view. The strong social constructivist view is that basically this process is unbounded. It's just being made up by people. And so different groups will make up different things. Um, the other side of the fence, which I think everyone is familiar with, is the nativist side, which is like there are cognitive universals. There are just, fundamental facts about the way the world is structured, and every person can see that. The strongest possible version of this is, that it's actually built into the natural world. That actually there are natural kinds in like, plants are different from animals. uh, what that's a hard line to swallow because the more science we do, the more we realize that like the nature of the natural world is not cleanly categorized the way that humans would like it to be. And so the next kind of step back is the psychological perspective, which is Eleanor Rosch became really famous for this view, is basically that these sorts of cognitive universals are built into human psychology. So humans just see the world structured, and whether there are natural kinds or not, we can't decide. But um, the world is structured by our psychology, and so when we see different social groups or different cultures arriving at very similar category systems, which, as I'll say in a minute, we do see that quite a bit. Um, Obviously, the social constructivist view can't explain that, but the cognitive universal view can, which is that there's some underlying structure to the brain that basically makes everyone see the same thing. Um, so we have lots and lots of examples of this geometry, flora, fauna, obviously, body parts, and even things that seem more social, like kinship and race and emotions, seem to show up consistently, in many different cultures. Now, it's not to say every culture is the same thing, but it's to say we see so much consistency that it requires explanation. And without this kind of, cognitive universal theory, which, has been called psychobiology, um, that without that, we don't really have any way of explaining it because the social constructivist view just gives us basically kind of some kind of path-dependent process that doesn't seem to suggest any kind of replication across societies. Um, so some of the work done by Roche that kind of helps to flesh this out is to say, okay, you give people this set of shapes, and these were all this sort of fairly famous psych studies done in the 70s and more were done in the 80s. People can sort of group these shapes in a way that is consistent, so that you bring in different people and different people from different cultures, and everyone kind of groups them the same way. Um, and so, the point here is really a very strong argument against like path dependence, which is, to say it's not, the historical process and it's not this sort of, coordination and communication within societies that creates these categories. These are principles of psychology. But there's a kind of an interesting problematization of this, which comes from more recent work in psychology, which says, look, if you give people things like squares and triangles, which are taught from a relatively young age, then yes, everyone will categorize. You'll find like lots of consistency across culture. But if you give people stimuli that's just weird and novel, which, when we're born, every, the argument is, most of the world looks weird and novel, um, then the question is, how do they categorize things then? And what you see is that some people choose, certain kinds of representations of objects, and other people choose other representations of objects, and other people choose yet even other representations of objects. And actually, at the individual level, this is independent of culture, just people do very different things when they're trying to sort of organize and categorize novel stimuli. And so what this does is this really fundamentally problematizes the nativist or kind of cognitive universal perspective, because if we don't have some sort of underlying, psychological tendencies to organize the world in a certain way. If people do lots of different things, then how do we ever get, large populations doing the same thing and seeing those same things across different independent cultures? Um, so the kind of classic view, and this is building on the sort of, cognitive universals picture, is that the more diversity there is in a society, the size of the social group, the more sort of individual variation there is in the categories and ideas people, suggest in terms of organizing the world, the less you're going to see similarity across different cultures. So if you had, you know, one group of size 4 and then another group of size 4 and they were totally independent, you can imagine that maybe there's limited diversity in each group and they might each come up with the same thing. But if you had, one group of size 50 or 100 and another group of size 50 or 100, then there's so much, diversity in terms of what each person sees, that the process of trying to determine, what the structure is of, the world around them and all the visual stimuli they're exposed to, um, would be so chaotic and path dependent that you wouldn't expect to see anything systematic across the two groups. So the more diversity there is in the categories, which is the same as saying the larger the groups are, um, the less you'd expect to see similarity across groups. And that's the kind of classic view. Um, and the sort of the way of talking about that is to say, obviously, the larger the vocabulary, the less likely that the vocabulary will be the same across different cultures. And then diversity creates opportunities for path dependence and these sort of emergent uh, processes that could correlate within a culture but not across cultures. Now, our theory and our perspective is really meant to be a direct refutation of this view. It's pretty much the exact opposite. Our view is that as the sort of size of social groups increases and as the diversity of categories that people are suggesting as individuals, then and basically the greater the variation is in a population, the more you're likely to see coordination and coherence, basically cross-cultural similarity emerging in each independent population. So that's a striking hypothesis because we're not suggesting that, interaction within a group creates coherence. We're saying that independent social groups all by themselves will uh, choose the same category system as a result of having more diversity in each of the different groups, right? And the theory behind this comes, as I sort of mentioned in the beginning, the kind of preface, from my earlier work on coordination dynamics and how that leads to sort of global convergence in a population, and then the expectation that those dynamics will actually be the same across populations. Um, and so there are, lots and lots of, illustrations and animations of this kind of process for, our earlier work, my earlier work with Andrea. Um, and this gives rise to a really clear, nice sort of evolutionary intuition, which is that there are some biases or some weak tendencies in populations. And in a small population, there's enough diversity that there's not any real evidence of that bias. It's not amplified in any way because there's just too few people to create kind of what you might think of as a critical mass around that view. But as you get larger and larger populations, even though you get more diversity, you also get kind of reinforcement for a specific uh, category system or a certain way of seeing the world that then winds up gaining much more social traction and faster social traction because it gets reinforced in the social network. And this is where the sort of theory of complex contagions and the logic of social reinforcement, building a sort of a critical mass and leading to essentially a tipping point, is essentially the underlying theory that leads us to this counterintuitive hypothesis. So I'm going to talk to you about the experimental design, which it's a novel design. Doug spent years working on this. It's a very interesting thing because there's several features of it that, in addition to just being able to test a theory like this, are unexpected in terms of the effectiveness of the empirical strategy. And then, of course, I'm going to get into the results. And I think some of the more interesting things here is that once you understand the results and we work through like your possible objections and see how robust these results are, there are some really non-obvious implications of this work for topics that are of immediate practical interest. Um, so this is a kind of obviously a hard theory to test, right? Because one of the sort of ideas historically in studying the kinds of dynamics is you are limited by the size of the social networks. It's hard to study people interacting in a real way to create meaning in a space. And so there were some great studies done in the 80s with, two or four or six people interacting in a network. But our thesis is that the size of the network is actually the central control parameter. So, that's a kind of a scope condition of when we would expect to see the results. So we need to study large social networks, and that, we need a method for doing that. And we need a novel and continuous set of stimuli. And what this really means is think about color and think about the color spectrum. Um, where the wavelengths are, it's a continuous smooth transition in wavelengths that generate these different colors for our eye. But we nevertheless chunk this up into discrete sets. We say, okay, we're going to call this red, we're going to call this blue, call this green, but there is no discrete difference between any of these. There's just a kind of organizing or categorizing process. And so if you think of the world that way, as just a bunch of kind of smooth transitions from one kind of stimuli to another, and yet we sort of organize it in a discrete fashion, the question is, how would you study that when just about everything that we come into contact with in the world actually is already organized, or at least everything we have a word for exists in a category. So all of our meaning systems are already embedded in categories. So how would you study people talking about something that they don't have any meaning system for, any category system for? And that was the challenge of this. And so what we do, the solution is we create basically a visual continuum that's very much like the color spectrum, except it's shapes. So kind of like a mutation of a blob in like a smooth and continuous way, and then see whether people kind of chunk that space up of like the blob shape into some sort of discrete grouping, right? That becomes our way of studying how people categorize things. Um, and then ultimately, we want to see, what the sort of the logic is of social interaction. So we need a social environment that makes sense to people. And this is kind of a principle of methodologically of all of the work I do, is that I worry a lot about why people are there, right? I don't think it's a good idea to just pay people money to come do a task and call that a social science experiment. That's, then what people are doing is doing a task for money. And if you're studying how people do tasks for money, then that's fine. But if you're trying to use that to study some other social process, to my mind, you've confused the incentives. People need to be there to do that social process. And I think that money is okay to use, but it needs to be used in sort of inside the logic of that social process. And so in this case, we study how people sort of coordinate on organizing this set of stimuli, and they're rewarded, they're given money for successful coordination, but they're also penalized. We take money away if they fail to coordinate. And so the financial logic of the space is directly related to this sort of social logic, which is this is fundamentally a game of communication and creating meaning. Um, so the logic here, as I mentioned at the beginning, is a logic of replicating at the group level. Um, so there are, for n equals 2, which is the smallest possible group you can have. And we also did n equals 1, right? So we have individuals trying to categorize things by themselves, like people have done in the past. But the interface looks different because there's no sort of dialogue process. Whereas in all the, starting with n equals 2 and going up to n equals infinity, you've got this kind of social process where people are sort of trying to categorize things together. Um, so for n equals 2, it's just a dyad. So, they interact the entire time. It's just two people interacting with each other. And then the question is, well, they should be able to succeed at creating meaning or creating categories out of the space. And the question is, what categories will they create? And then n equals 50 is 50 people in one space simultaneously online engaging in this process. Interestingly, the way we do this is through pairwise interactions. So what we do is we take all 50 people, and you can imagine this in a series of rounds. So in round 1, we take everyone and match them up into pairs. So you have 25 pairs. And then they play the game just like the n equals 2 case. They just try to coordinate on some side, and I'll describe this in detail in a moment. Um, And then, that round is over. They either succeeded or failed, all 25 pairs. And then we rematch everyone into 25 new pairs. And we just kind of iterate through this process of basically people trying to coordinate with other people. Um, and of course, like I said, in n equals 2 case, people are just interacting with the same people each time. Now, one of the things is that this is a hard game, is that to figure out how to categorize the space takes a long time. So people had to be in this study, like engaged. It takes mental energy to sort of succeed at this. And it takes memory too, because you're interacting over the course of an hour and there's a lot of stuff happening, and these shapes are not obviously anything. Um, so over the course of an hour, we have over 100 interactions for, people in each group. One of the questions you should ask yourself is, why were people willing to stay in this study when, like, at the end of the day, they won like maybe $2 or $3? And again, it has to be a social experience that people recognize and want to participate in order to make that, that kind of design work. So this is the blob continuum I described, and if this works properly, this animation should play for you. There you go. So we took a shape and just mutated it in a continuous fashion. So there you can see, um, and it's a Rorschach test, right? So like, what do you see? Um, and so you can see this process unfolding. But what people see is just slices of this process, right? You can see this along the bottom. We basically create a continuum of 1,500 images that are grabbed from this smooth transition. Now, there's no natural way of breaking up this smooth transition because just like the color spectrum, it's completely continuous. But what we'd like to see is whether or not people group them and create kind of categories out of these shapes. So the way the game is played is that in each pairwise interaction, on each round, it starts with one person randomly being assigned the speaker, and one person randomly assigned being the hearer. Now, speaker and hearer is randomly assigned to each pair in each round. So sometimes you're the speaker, sometimes you're the hearer. But the experience of being the speaker and the hearer are different. So the speaker gets this set of shapes, and we highlight one of the shapes. And we basically take 3 random shapes selected from that continuum, and like I said, the paper is coming out, so all the details for this are in the main method section, of course, and also in the supporting information. Um, but it's all of the expected rigor is maintained here. So of course the shapes are randomized in their order, left to right. The shapes are randomly selected, and we tested for randomness, so there's no difference in like the selection strategy across shapes, across conditions, and so forth. But basically, so with those tests successfully done, then you can say there were 3 random shapes selected from this massive continuum, and we would highlight one of them and ask you to select a description of that shape that would allow your partner, the speaker, or sorry, that your partner, the hearer, to pick that shape out of this lineup of shapes, right? So you can think about what you might type in to identify the shape on the right. This person typed in baby, okay? Um, so then now you're the hearer. So that the speaker's done, they send their answer, and the hearer sees the word baby and is asked to figure out which of these images correspond to baby, right? And if the person selects baby, then they win some money. And if they select the wrong image, then they lose money, right? And so then the round is over. They've all learned something. For the hearer, they've learned the word baby. For the speaker, they've either learned that baby is successful for that image or not. Now, because we never use the same image set twice, it's randomly selected, and we ensured that people would never see in the course of a round. There are 1,500 images, and each person only plays 100 rounds. So we were able to ensure that no person would see the same image twice, which means if a person used the same label more than once, then they were de facto categorizing. They were grouping independent, distinct images under a single umbrella, right? So they weren't just naming a thing, they were saying this set of things is now called baby. Um, and that again is in reference to, or analogous to the color system, where you've got this sort of smooth change in wavelength, but you've got a term red, which groups together a bunch of different things, and we call them all red. So in terms of the results, I'm going to walk you through just briefly what the results look like. And then, of course, we'll show you the findings that we're excited about. But it's important to sort of know how to read these figures first. So of course, on the x-axis, you've got the continuum of shapes, right? Which, it's ranges from 0 to 1400. And then you've got these basically these sort of density plots, which show the frequency with which people coordinated successfully on terms. So there's a couple of interesting things to point out. First, on the far left, you see that people coordinated on the word sit. So, that became a category for describing that, region of the continuum. On the far right, the word hockey became an effective term or category for coordinating it in that region. Hug has a weird shape to it, right? Where there are parts of the space that people coordinated on, and then it has kind of a bimodal part where there's another part of the space, but in the middle people weren't able to coordinate. So it's not always these kind of perfect prototype theoretic distributions around like a single shape, and then everyone coordinates on that shape. It's more interesting and more subtle than that. But I think one of the other really interesting things is what's happening, but basically between 400 and 800. You've got this space of the continuum where people just couldn't figure it out. And so this is the importance of thinking about categories as meaning systems, because it means that every single shape in that space, and that's like 400 slices of shapes, basically couldn't be identified as anything. And so this was just kind of a space, whereof people couldn't speak. And so they just had to, try to figure it out, but they failed. And so basically, when you look at like how people talk and how they can sort of identify relevant objects, and so you can now, invoke your relevant cultural comparison. You can say, oh, right, it's like certain cultures have complex words for, natural events like cloud types or snow type or whatever it is. But other cultures don't. They basically don't have any discriminating feature in that space. That the sort of meaning system that's created here is really a function of where people were able to communicate. Okay, so now we can look across independent pairs. We're going to look at the n equals 2 case. Remember, these are replicated trials. So we can look at the sort of category system or meaning system created for each of the pairs. So this is one pair. You can see there's a couple things to notice. So they have the word to this pair coordinates on the word fly for a similar region as the first pair coordinated on the word sit. So that's interesting because those two things mean basically the opposite. And so now you've got two groups. You got two people in the first group and two people in the second group, where if they tried to talk to each other, they would basically be using opposite concepts to refer to the same sort of part of the space. Interestingly, also, people in the second group use the word man to refer to the region of the space that the first group wasn't able to come to any meaningful description of. And so you get these differences across the n equals 2 groups in terms of the category systems they create, not just in the terms they come up with and the kind of conceptual reference they develop, but also in terms of like their capacity to speak coherently or to kind of create coherent meaning in various sort of parts or partitions of this sort of system. And so you can think about this again in terms of color. It would be as if like certain people just said, okay, all this is red. Or there's a set of colors that I basically just describe it as white light, and somebody from another community says, no, actually it's not. There's a lot going on there. That's like, this is iridescent white, and this is like perfectly white light. This is like yellow light. These things are like these versions of white light, soft white, hard light, so on and so forth. And that those would be meaningless and undetectable in some ways to people who aren't in that community. They have no way of talking about it. Okay, so now we can look across other groups and still other groups, and what you see here is that there's a lot of differences conceptually and structurally in terms of how people are organizing this space. Now, of course, we ran a bunch of these, so you can see now across a lot of different trials, which is groups of n equals 2, just how much diversity is created. So now this is consistent with the more recent evidence from psychological studies, suggesting that the whole sort of nativist, cognitive universals idea just doesn't work when we look, at individuals trying to make sense of novel spaces. And this is important because this is a really uh, uh, damning result for the kind of the strong nativist position, which had argued that where you get agreement across cultures from and where you get similar category systems across cultures from is that there's some underlying psychological tendency. So we are just not seeing it, right? In fact, the significance tests are like there is no significant overlap at all across, all these trials. And we have lots and lots of data. We have 80 of these trials. So if there was something, we would find it. Um, and there's just nothing. So this raises of course, the crucial question that is the center point of this paper, which is, well, if the classic nativist theory, the cognitive universal theory, doesn't get us an answer, in fact, it seems to be falsified, then why do we see agreement across cultures? Where does it come from? How's it possible? And our theory, remember, is that it's something counterintuitive, which is the very communication process that the social constructivists had thought gave rise to path dependence and differences across culture. We're arguing that that same communication process actually gives rise to coherence and convergence across cultures. Right? That's the strong new hypothesis we have here. Um, so here's one replication of the n equals 50. And what you see here is that the distribution looks different in terms of the space that people agreed on. The left-hand space where n equal 2 had meaning, there's like basically nothing for n equals 50. And there's some clear terms. There's couch, crab, frog, and bunny. And then we look at another group, an independent group, n equals 50, and strikingly, they have really similar descriptions of the space. Now, this alone, this never happens with n equals 2. So seeing this is striking. But it would be more striking if we saw it again and again and again. And in fact, that's what we see. We see across 15 replicated trials, like a tremendous amount of consistency across these large groups. In fact, it's, not only is it, statistically significant, but like in a way, that's almost a second order thing. The first thing is like, it's just qualitatively different than what's happening in n equals 2. And so there's something happening in terms of the way that networks and social interaction create coherence in people's understanding of a topic or people's sort of ability to make meaning out of these spaces that simply isn't happening with individuals and small groups. So now to go back to our sort of core prediction, right? Our core prediction had to do with, I've shown you these two extreme cases, n equals 2 and n equals 50. But of course, your question really ought to be, okay, those are two endpoints, but you made a prediction about what happens in the middle. Maybe it's like a really complicated space. But so when we look at these dynamics and we see, okay, across this complicated space, the traditional prediction is that it should be, high cultural similarity across groups when there's like low diversity and sort of small groups, and basically zero agreement across groups when the groups are large and there's a lot of diversity. And of course, our prediction is the opposite. So this is what the data show. N equals 2, you basically have no agreement, right? And so that's a refutation of the original thesis of the standard view. But then with n equals 6, you see increasing, n equals 8, n equals 24, and n equals 50. And so this is the evidence that we want to show that, in fact, there is this dynamic by which group size is doing this work at actually increasing the cross-cultural coherence of people's category systems. And I can show you that actually the experimental data are tighter than the model, which is remarkable. That the model obviously predicts this trend, which is where we get that line from. But the clarity of the experimental data stands out in terms of the the lack of variability. It really is a very specific effect of group size on these dynamics of cross-cultural convergence. Um, so what's going on here? And this is, I think this is it's a data science group, so we can go into this in some detail. But so what's going on here? The fundamental mechanism is, as I mentioned at the beginning, a tipping point mechanism. And so what that means is that there are certain options that show up with greater frequency, and then a lot of options that show up, that are basically idiosyncratic options that, just show up occasionally from, lots of different people, but don't show up independently across people. And now in the smaller groups, you know, the the what are called maybe popular options don't get a lot of reinforcement because you also have the idiosyncratic options showing up. And so the small groups wind up converging lots of times on the idiosyncratic options. In a large group, you're pretty much guaranteed to get some subset of people who are choosing, the options that are, basically the options that are sort of higher tendency, or the options for which the population is slightly biased. And so what that does is it creates kind of a core critical mass around that option that then generates a process of social reinforcement. Now, this is the logic of complex contagion, is that as people see an option multiple times from multiple people, that creates more influence and more willingness to adopt whatever your idiosyncratic option was and then move to this new one. And then, of course, then you add to the reinforcement and so on and so forth. And this is how tipping point dynamics, get off the ground. Um, and so, this is exactly what we see when we see the likelihood of the kind of high frequency options, these, choices that show up with greater frequency, becoming um, uh, uh, successful. Um, we see that that happens more often in larger populations and basically never happens with n equals 2, right? And so this story of reinforcement and tipping dynamics is really cleanly mapped onto the story of increasing group size and category convergence, and helps to explain why we see so much convergence across different groups. Um, Now, it's useful to, before getting to the Q&A, actually talk about some of the possible injections, which we actually include this stuff in the paper because it's a radical hypothesis. And so there's a lot of questions that, you should naturally have about this design and about what we ultimately show. One obvious question is, well, isn't it just the case that there are certain options that are better than others and that they always win, right? And so crab, as I showed you, in the results, shows up for the networks. So wouldn't you expect crab to then always win? And isn't that a trivial explanation of what you're finding? But of course, what we see in the dyads is that for that same image, when crab shows up, we're seeing other options actually win, outcompete crab, right? So it's not just that like crab crab occurred to people because um, we have crab showing up a lot. It's that crab dominates the sort of the social coordination process and ultimately the categorization process. And so in dyads, even though crab is showing up, crab isn't winning. And that's the social dynamic that we're interested in, is not whether options are suggested, but which options wind up becoming kind of coherent vehicles for population coordination. And in dyads, these options like crab don't, right? So that's the first important result. Sorry, there's more similar in boat. Um, so one thing you can think about is, whether or not this theory has a counterfactual prediction, and it does. So our counterfactual prediction, and this is important because you know it's one thing to run an experiment and then to describe the data. It's one thing to say the experiment confirms our theory, and so we should be able to alter the experiment in a way that is consistent with our theory. So um, basically we're saying, look, crab is showing up and just de facto gaining enough critical mass that is taking over the population. What that theory means is that if we were to put another option into the population such that it gained critical mass instead of one of the kind of other terms that we see showing up, that option should instead win. In other words, it's not the crab term itself, and it's not the crabbiness of that image. Rather, it's the reinforcement that the term crab is getting that's generating this coordination. So to test that, we can run a counterfactual experiment where we say, okay, we're going to put in Confederates into our experiment who are going to pump another term into that same space for that space of the continuum where the word crab is dominant. um, we're going to pump the word sumo into that space, which was not a popular term in our sort of, in our original studies. And so we're going to use this as an intervention to show that that dynamic by itself is sufficient to lead the population to a new category system, despite the fact that crab is present. And so this is what we get when we run that study. We get, we have sumo and crab, and we have, a small set of Confederates, um, typing typing the word sumo in every time they're trying to coordinate. And we want to see whether creating that critical mass actually changes the dynamic. And in fact, it does. Sumo winds up going to fixation as the dominant category for that space, even though crab is in that space with the same frequency, as it was in the previous networks. Um, and so this is a really, to my mind, a very important demonstration because it shows that we can take this theory and explore the counterfactual hypothesis and show that in fact the only real explanation for what's happening here isn't the intrinsic or native value of these terms in describing these spaces, but rather the way these terms get reinforced in the social network. And if you feel like one demonstration of this isn't sufficient, well, then we replicated it 6 times. And so that it's now statistically significant at the 0.01 level. That yes, in fact, if you do this sort of reinforcement process, you actually get this unpopular term, this idiosyncratic term, becoming the dominant term in every single trial, right? So um, this is interesting, not just in terms of like the quantitative, rigor of it, which I think is the main reason for doing it, but also in terms of like what this gives you, in terms of some of the things you want to conclude, some of the things you want to infer from a design like this, from an experiment like this, where you want to say, well, what's happening here? Is it really that people are like starting to see the world differently? They're actually creating a meaning system where, you know, people aren't seeing red anymore. They're seeing like orange, and they're seeing, new shades of color in this space, and then they're actually seeing that when they look at different colors. And so we gave people a question, a kind of a questionnaire at the end that was just kind of qualitative, open entry, just kind of describe the shape. Um, and what was interesting is that when we did this in the regular condition, and we did this also in the intervention, right, which we ran at the end as our robustness test, our robustness experiments, um, that people in the robustness experiment used the not just the word sumo, but use descriptions that match that sort of characterization of that part of the space, of that part of the category space. And so what this suggests is that people, by virtue of being in a social environment where people were talking about this term and it was being reinforced, they sort of saw that space that way now. People didn't see crabs anymore. They saw, they saw a man reaching his arms into the air. So what you see here, of course, is the quantitative version of those dynamics, which is that the term crab is used occasionally. Sorry, the term crab is used obviously in the case with no Confederates, and also it's used a lot in the term with Confederates. But the term sumo, in terms of people's responses after the fact, is never used in the initial conditions, right? No one describes it as a man with his arms in the air, but we do see people doing that in the cases where we have the intervention. Um, so one other objection is people could say, oh, look, if you just gave people more time, they would. Oh, people are. All right. Yeah, shouldn't look at the group chat while I'm giving a talk. All right, if you just gave people more time, maybe the groups interacted for longer. If the dyads were given more time, maybe they would all converge too. So it's not true. If you give the dyads much more time, in fact, it just plateaus. They just fixate on whatever idiosyncratic category system they were creating, and then they just stay with that. So it doesn't lead to convergence at all. So It's a satisfying, demonstration that in fact, the issue with convergence isn't, more interactions or longer interactions. It's the fundamental dynamics of the network. Um, and then, of course, to answer this other question, just about, images being drawn from different parts of um, the continuum. No, images were, universally drawn from all parts of the continuum, and there was no likelihood in one image being shown more than another. So that's not what was driving convergence on this sort of same set of images across independent social conditions. Um, so fundamentally, we have a set of conclusions here, which is that individual category formation doesn't lead to cross-group similarity. And it's extremely hard to predict what individuals and small groups are going to do. However, um, somehow this process of network interaction and critical mass dynamics, tipping points, allows large groups to be strikingly predictable. So this goes against everything that that social constructivists and that people have traditionally argued in terms of what makes cultural trends intuitive, is that increasing diversity actually increases predictability in the dynamics of category formation and meaning systems. And this also suggests sort of a new and deeper theory about the value of communication networks in basically filtering cognitive and lexical diversity among people to create sort of shared category systems and shared meaning. Um, I don't know that I have enough time. Maybe I'll let Matt chime in here. There's discussions about ongoing work with we ran a study. People are going to ask questions about actual cross-cultural studies, running them in different, and we ran the same study in China, and so I have data on that we're currently writing up, and then applications to other domains like content moderation on social media, which is another domain where people are like classifying novel content continuously and trying to come up with some sort of system for it. And so we've run a study on that as well. That's remarkably clear in terms of the implications of these sorts of results for that kind of domain. Um, but before I can talk about all of that, but it'll take us right up into the end. So I just want to make sure I have a chance to sort of follow the format of the seminar here if people have questions.
Uh, I think it's more or less up to you. I'm sure there are people who have questions. I include myself among them. Um, so, uh, if you wanted to maybe highlight one or two things from the ongoing work, and then we can just have the rest of the time for questions, or however else you'd like to structure the
Yeah, I
call.
think I think it's good. I mean, it's you don't want to sit there and listen to someone for an hour and then um, not be able to ask a question. So I think it's good to be able to give that. I'll take about 2 minutes then,
Great.
and just say briefly. And this is the stuff that we haven't published yet, so I actually don't want any of these images circulated until these papers come out. Um, so we ran this study in China, which, by the way, internationalization of an experiment like this is weirdly hard because the logic of people we had to create obviously a new shape system just because it's a new study, um, but the instructions had to be written in uh, intelligible and coherent Chinese, and then the dynamics of using uh, ideograms here in this text entry space is different because obviously the number of characters in the Roman alphabet is different than the number of ideograms in terms of like the amount of stuff you can say. So anyway, after all of that work was done, we ran the study, and you see exactly the same thing, and here you have the interpretations on the right hand side of each of the characters. Um, that people create this like highly diverse systems for n equals 2, and you see this remarkable convergence for n equals 50 and n equals 24. So this is exciting because it's exactly what we were hoping to see. And like I said, we're writing this up now, so we're developing a kind of the logic for the kind of coherence of these results across the Chinese study and the American study. Um, the social media application, this is a grant we got from Facebook to apply this sort of category work to the problem of content classification. Obviously, people know that this is incredibly hard because people disagree a lot about what should be left up and what should be taken down, and what's sexist, what's racist, what's profanity, and so forth. So you know companies like Facebook have, people sitting there one at a time trying to figure this out. And this is, consistent with our theory that like individuals trying to doing this are going to come up with like radically different systems of classifying this stuff. And the strategy of, Facebook and all these companies, YouTube and so forth, has been to just take the average. So it'd be like taking the average of this, which is like, well, okay, it doesn't actually tell you anything coherent, the average of this. It just tells you, uh, some sort of, real number that you can use maybe for making decisions, but it's not going to make anyone happy. So what you'd like to see is some sort of process by which consensus and coherence will lead to some underlying collective intelligence in determining, what to do. So we ran this study, and this was a very hard study to construct because, we had to create these visual continua, or a series of continua, based on real images, obviously, and to think about, and even testing this was mentally and emotionally stressful because you have to look at a lot of really horrific images. So one of the other questions we had was, how painful is it? One of the issues with content moderation is that content moderators quit a lot because they're just so stressed out and, have some symptoms of PTSD after doing this day after day for like 6 to 8 months. It's not fun. Um, and so we ran this study, but one of the interesting results we got, I don't have time to get into it now, is that our dynamics not only led to interesting results in terms of the actual classification of images and the agreement about what should be taken down versus left up, but also it showed that the experience of the people in our network condition was qualitatively different than the experience of people who did this individually, where individuals reported like for strongly negative feelings about having to do this study, and people who did it in groups reported actually positive feelings about, coming to some agreement about, the acceptability of images and the kind of social aspect of, looking at these things and coming to terms with them collectively. So anyway, the results are compelling that you see individuals, devise lots of different labels, groups devise consistent labels. I mean, it's the kind of thing, this image would be striking if you hadn't seen everything else before. But, with this theory in hand, it's exactly what you expect to see. And it's nice to see the theory generalized to this domain. Interestingly, you also see this with decisions to take down content, different in the individual condition and consistent in the network condition. There's more to say, but I think I'll stop with that since I have to teach at 4. So I'm happy to take a question or two.
Okay, great. Let's also thank our speaker with a digital or physical applause to your
Thank you.
liking. So our interested remaining audience members, please ask questions should you have them.
Yeah, so I mean, I know you're being kind of provocative in the anti-nativist rhetoric,
Right.
but I mean, I really, really don't see what this has to do with nativism at all. I don't know of any nativist theory that ever predicted that you should, the 10 people or however many people should all see the same Rorschach and all spontaneously call it the same thing. If nativism had predicted that, then nativism would have died when the Rorschach test was originally invented. And psychoanalysts realized that, different people can look at the same Rorschach and call it different things. I mean, so that's really, that's just not a prediction of any nativist theory that I've ever heard of. So I don't know.
I mean, I was being provocative, of course, right? So that's fine. But of course, the strongest claims that we're responding to are those of Eleanor Roche, and particularly the design of studies in which, images like tables and images like squares are given, and they see replication, and then use that as evidence for cognitive universals, and for some sort of underlying pattern of organization. And where we want to problematize that is with, with kind of starting with Shepard, is with the question of novel stimuli, and more importantly, the micro-macro aggregation, right? Because fundamentally, we don't want to, the point of this paper isn't to make a psychological argument. The point of the paper is to say, can we infer the origins of, similarities in the organization of material across cultures? Can we infer that from, what we see people do, which was the kind of claim Eleanor Roche was making. And so we kind of start there and build from that into a lot of the literature. So this is also in like organizational ecology. So there are a lot of social scientists, and this is like the work going on at Stanford GSB currently, a lot of social scientists who take this as like a bedrock intuition for building kind of a logic of how categories operate. And so we're pushing back on those implications and applications in social science.
Yeah, so I mean, I think one problem here is that you're kind of not distinguishing between the concepts and the words that we use to coordinate around communicating about the concepts, right? So absolutely, there's no doubt that we converge on the same terminology when you've got three pictures and I have to get you to pick out which picture I have in mind. But that's a really different thing than having any sort of change in either of our conceptual systems. So, I say dog and a French speaker will say chien. And if we both have to talk about a dog, we have to figure out how we're going to talk about it. And we might converge on dog, we might converge on chien, we might converge on some other sound, as long as it gets, the French speaker to get that idea in their head when I say it. But none of us is changing our concept of dog when we're doing that, right? We're coordinating around what label we're using to refer to the same concept. We're not coordinating around what the content of that concept is.
So let me ask you, how do you know you're not changing your concept of a dog?
Well, I don't know, but how do you know that you are? I mean, you're just
That's my point, right? Is that I don't need to make a strong claim about that, right? All I need to do is to talk about, no, because the question here is categorization, which doesn't just involve labels, it involves partitions, right? And so this is the point about the space, which is that there are parts of the space where people could organize coherent communication, and there are parts of the space where they couldn't. And what's so interesting about this result isn't that people use the label like hit or use the label fly, right? What's interesting about it is that people sort of saw, coherent meaning in one part of the space and not in another part of the space. But the groups were able to create coherent meaning out of this like completely undifferentiated continuum of shapes. And so
yeah,
if
so
you,
what I'm saying
right,
is you're calling it coherent meaning, and I'm calling it they couldn't figure out what word to use that would get the other person to pick out the right thing, right? That's not that they couldn't figure out coherent meaning around what this thing looked like to
is
them.
it, or, I
Like
mean, we don't know. I mean, that's what I'm saying. My study is not a psychology study. And I
no.
think
I
that,
mean,
yeah.
we do know nobody thinks that any of those squiggles are a bat or a hockey player or any of those things, right? Those are clearly that's not a hockey player. Nobody thinks that's a hockey player.
Okay. So
It's a
that,
it's a
that's
big
a part.
symbolic approximation of something you might call a hockey player when you're trying to describe it to someone else.
So this again, this is something that you and I might take offline because it sounds like we're going to go back and forth in this. So I'm not going to concede that. I'm going to say when you say clearly, it sounds like just a statement of evidential fact, and I would say that like I'm not sure self-evidence works as actual
Well,
scientific
a hockey
evidence
player
here.
has to be able to hit a puck. The squiggle on the screen isn't going to hit a puck. I mean,
So
I don't know.
that
This
so
doesn't seem
again,
terminological
so
to me. This
no,
just seems,
well,
yeah.
that's my point about semantics, right? Because we're going to get into Gavagai territory really fast, right? Where like what's going to wind up happening is you're going to say, well, a dog is a dog, and I'm going to say, well, maybe it's independent time slices of a dog, right? How do you know? How do you know what I'm thinking when I'm saying the word dog? All we know is that it's behavioral. And so fundamentally, maybe where you and I differ is that I'm a Wittgensteinian when it comes to meaning. I think meaning as use is the fundamental way we should think about, pragmatics when we think about how people construct meaning systems. And that's why I'm referring to these as meaning systems. So I think that that's maybe a good place for us to, it sounds like you and I should email offline and talk about this, but when I think you and I, from a sort of semantics, pragmatics point of view, have different theoretical orientations. That's fine. I think there's interesting stuff to talk about. I'm not sure it's going to help us work out, your interpretation of the study. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not saying we need to have the same theoretical commitments. I think you're absolutely right that we don't. I'm just saying that you're taking this as evidence for your commitments. And I'm just saying it's not that, right? You can interpret it through your commitments. That's fine. And I can interpret it through mine. But it's clearly not evidence in favor of yours and against mine.
Well, to the extent that I'm interpreting it through a kind of Wittgensteinian pragmatic lens, then I would say that, yeah, the people in the study are doing work, and that work is proving functional in terms of their ability to communicate with one another and create, value in the sense of like winning money, right? And so I would call that an underlying meaning system that they've created. Now you can interrogate that and say, I don't buy that that's actually a hockey player, but we don't know what's in those people's heads. And I'm like loath to speculate whether that person says that's a crab, that actually is a crab, versus like that's a picture that I'm using right. I mean, it's like you can do a definite description that's infinitely long, but whether or not that actually gives us traction on what's in someone's head versus being a convenient philosophical tool, I would say I'm going to you sort of be agnostic on that question and just say, from a pragmatic point of view, these are people creating novel category systems as a result of the social structure they're in. And that's, to me, that's the sort of the strong claim I want to make.
Also,
But please,
in the
Roman,
spirit of
email me. I'd love to
pragmatism,
talk more about this, though. I think
and
it's very interesting.
also in the spirit of pragmatism, I'll just ask if anyone else remaining has a question they or she would like to ask. Anyone else? I have a question
Yeah.
related to the previous one. I am not a scholar of categories or concepts, but so I appreciated the talk very much from a network dynamics perspective.
Yeah.
But on the subjects of categories and concepts, do you think there would have been a difference in your results if you had enforced that subjects applied, for example, arbitrary numeric labels that that one would assert and then the other one would have to agree on, or something like that? Or if, for example, subjects were sitting around a table and received the images on cards and had to push them into clusters on the table or something like that. Because it would seem to me, and I have no theoretical social commitments about this, that there might be a difference between mapping one set of categories, which is pre-existing in the form of those words that they chose, onto the novel continuous stimuli, a difference between that and the enforcement of or the creation of new and completely arbitrary label.
Yeah, so you're wondering about this critical mass dynamic, and you're saying, look, if you were to use something like a bizarre space of symbols, would you still see these critical mass dynamics emerging, right? And so what we know is that in prototype studies we've run, just kind of like building it and testing it, we played around with like drop down menus, right, where we could put a list of like weird symbols, and qualitatively the dynamics in drop down menus can be the same, but we didn't replicate that, at very large scales, only because it's, time consuming and costly. And we also felt like what was interesting about this was it was this completely novel space that people could just like do anything they want in that space, and make up anything they wanted. And you can see that in the variation you see in the Chinese condition, just like a huge, conceptual range of like the different kinds of things they're putting into that space. And so we were more interested in seeing that than in seeing that sort of replication. But that's exactly the kind of replication that like is trivial to do because we've already built the capacity to do that. What's We can do it as a robustness study. I guess my only question is, is there anything interesting other than just saying, yeah, look, you can do this with a drop down list with like 45 elements. Creates weird issues because like then you need to worry about order effects, right? When elements are at the top of the list, then you have to randomize elements, which then means people have to, if they want to find the same element, sort through a random list each time they're playing, which is cognitively demanding. So these are practical issues, but this is kind of where it gets to when you start saying, well, why not test that? And it's like, well, it becomes its own study to figure out how to test, forcing people into that space, to do that kind of thing. I would say that in terms of everything we know, and in terms of the robustness tests we've run with this and with the previous studies, that yeah, the dynamics do work the same, but we've not been able to replicate this scale because we wouldn't know how to run it in a way that's feasible. But that's a methodological constraint. And if there's a good theoretical reason for saying like, I would really like to know this because it would then enlighten this whole other set of questions, then it's worth taking a year to figure out how to build that in a way that would allow people to like search through, that they wouldn't have to spend 2 minutes looking through a list that was randomly ordered, right, to figure out what symbol the person clicked on. Anyway, I would say that yes, it's an interesting question. Yes, my intuitions lean in that direction. Hard to study right now. Yeah, but maybe that's
Naturally, I
something.
see.
Yeah, but that's not all meant to say that it's maybe you want to build it. And you can all of our code is online. Oh, I meant to say that the Network Dynamics Group site, this paper is coming out at the end of December on Nature Communications, and so like all the data will be published. All of our code is on GitHub. Like, it's the kind of thing it's meant to be replicated.
Okay, great. Any final thoughts from people in the Zoom room? All right, if not, one more round of applause, and I invite people, I'm not sure I should say this, but further questions, I guess.
Oh, email me, please. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely. Great.
fabulous.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Okay, bye. Bye.